Entering the Pat Mayo Experience.
Pat Mayo Experience. Pat Mayo Experience. Pat Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, presented by DraftKings. Behind the scenes of fantasy football and fantasy football content creation. Yes, this is going to be a sprawling chat with no real direction, but I want to give a sort of behind the scenes look of what actually goes on. Because I think that a lot of people see it from the outside, and a lot of people think that this is a dream job if you can get paid to do it, which you are not wrong about, by the way. It is a dream job to be able to do this, but there's a lot that goes into it that maybe that you guys don't necessarily see or don't even know. I know a lot of people know. I know some people don't know. Hey, give me the picks is what they want. But what goes into giving the picks and that kind of thing and getting people to watch and actually creating a career out of this and just sort of the time commitments or lack of time commitments that it takes to a lot of this stuff. So I want everyone to smash the like button to the video because that is very helpful to everyone. Subscribe to Mayo Media Network. Share the show around if you find this chat interesting. And in the comment section, I don't know, we need comments to rig the algorithm somehow. So give me one piece of content that is not out there right now that you think that you would like to see. Now, whether or not I can do that or not, someone else can do it or not, I just, that's invaluable stuff to know. Like, what is lacking in the marketplace right now for fantasy football? Because it seems like there's a never-ending stream of different things going on within either the video space, the podcasting space, the written space, the social media space. But what is sort of a gap that you see right now that you think that can be filled? And actually, I mean, it doesn't even need to be profitable. It can just be out there. Like IDP is one that people have talked about for years that people just don't do. It's because no one fucking plays IDP. So no one who is trying to make money at this wants to focus on IDP because it's not going to bring in any money. So to break this down with me are two other content creators who we can talk about process, we can talk about goals, we can talk about how you can actually sustain a living. First up, from dailyroto.com, from sportsgrid.com, host of the TakeCast, it is Davis Mattek, everyone's favorite guest. What's going on?
Not much. Very excited to have this conversation where I get to complain about my job that people think that I am not qualified to have. That's really my goal here, is to just put people on massive tilt.
Well, it'll be good for the rigging the algorithm in the comment section, because I'm going to get the first 5 comments are like, Davis is on, I'm not listening. So, that actually helps us out. So it's always like when I used to have Siege on all the time, people just be really triggered that Siege was on. It's like, you're actually helping us by like commenting on how much you hate Siege. It would just like propel the views to the video to go up. Also, you can find him over at the Pete Overzet YouTube channel. It's Pete Overzet. Now, first time, full year in fantasy football creation as like a full-timer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even coming up on a full year. I mean, I'm like 2.5 months in. But yeah, very excited to be here and talking IDP with you guys today.
Of course. We got to break down who's going to see the most tackles so far at outside linebacker that you can really mine that safe floor from your linebacker position. But I don't know. I don't really even know where I want to start with this conversation. I guess I can lead it with me. I've been doing full-time fantasy football content since 2009. So I am going into season either 12 or 13 of this now. And fun fact, I didn't get paid until 2013, despite the fact that I was doing it full-time. It's just so different how my priorities have changed over that time. Like I was like, the work weeks have actually gotten shorter somehow with the more efficient that I've become at doing this. And just learn skills over time. And I used to write a 5,000 word column every single week for like 6 years, Davis. It would take me 18 hours to write. Like I'd basically just smoke a joint, start at 5 p.m. and finish up at like 10 a.m. the next morning and just like try to submit it. And it's full of like craziness. People seem to like that. I won awards for that article. I don't have the time to do that anymore. As I'm married. I have 2 very small children. I like getting up in the morning with, at 5:30 a.m. with my sons to spend time with them for 2.5 hours before they go to school. Like that wasn't really a part of my life when I first started doing this. So I guess we'll start with managing expectations about time. Like, how do you consolidate your time? I know you're big on the double life stack. So you both like work out and grind like news at the gym as you go along.
Yeah, I mean, I am big on habit stacking. That's actually something that I learned from a book that Pete and I's buddy Patrick Laird introduced to us, Atomic Habit. I think James Clear is the guy who wrote that. So, I mean, I guess in terms of providing content, you absolutely have to stay on the news. Like you can't be in the middle of working on something and like just realize that Latavius Murray is going to be cut and Tony Jones Jr. is the second running back. And then also, if you're doing a ton of drafts, which I consider to be, I consider doing a ton of drafts to be part of my job because I need to be able to have intelligent conversations on the TV show, on the podcast, in my written stuff. Like, I think you can definitely tell from people's content when they are not playing a ton of competitive fantasy football. And I don't think this is the same argument as like, you can only have an opinion if you're playing high stakes. Like, I don't think that's true. Like, I don't think you need to be playing the main event, or for DFS, like, I don't think you need to be playing, thousands of dollars in entries, but I think you need to be playing competitively to some degree. But also, much like you, Pat, my original work in fantasy and in DFS was like, I was doing a ton of written content. So I'd write, my 3,000 word column for DFS. I'd write NBA DFS articles that would be useless in 8 hours. I'd write MLB DFS articles that would be useless in 8 hours. And probably the biggest transition from like 2012, 13, 14 to now is the lack of written content. And some people get bummed out by that. Some people really like the written content. They like to open the article, see the bolded names and be like, all right, those are the plays. But I mean, and I bet Pete agrees with this too. People in general tend to create a better bond. Like, you find better relationships with the people who engage with your content via audiovisual stuff.
I think that depends, really. Like, I used to get far more engagement football-wise, but I get that through the course of the show now, whether it's like doing a live chat and responding to the YouTube comments, doing a Twitter Q&A. But like, people used to send me, maybe it's just the way that people communicated 8 years ago, but like, I'd have my email at the bottom of my giant column. People would like ask me questions or be like, hey, I like this part. I didn't like this part. So I think that there was always that communication, but it just seems like you feel more connected with people, Pete, when you see them on video. It feels like you know them.
Yeah, it does. And I remember experiencing that when I first started listening to podcasts. I was listening to a ton of comedy podcasts, and I remember feeling like these guys were my friends. And that was one of those moments where it really clicked for me of, wow, this is a powerful medium. I think the interesting thing too is just like the various feedback loops, even with podcasts, like getting comments and feedback is kind of hard. I guess people can write you on Twitter and say, they enjoyed something. I have that similar with the newsletter. I write the Fantasy Life newsletter, and I don't get a ton of feedback unless I have a typo, and then I get 9 DMs from people I've never talked to. But that, I think, is also an interesting thing where, people who do like to write and who like to tweet, I feel like the feedback mechanisms are a little bit more direct. Reply to this tweet, comment on the article. So I think that's an interesting dynamic with it too. But yeah, the audio video is definitely, I think, more powerful for helping people feel like they truly know you.
And that was a big pivot for me probably about 6-7 years ago. Like, I've had the podcast for about 10 years now, but it was pretty sporadic for the first few years, maybe once a week. And then when I joined the Fantasy Sports Network, which was the first ever 24/7 fantasy sports television network, not a success. Turns out terrestrial TV, not the place for like canned content when stuff is changing all the time. The web was probably a bit better for that. But I started doing 3 times a week. Then I just ended up going every single day when I started doing all the production myself for both audio and video. I was able to support that with like 85-hour weeks, but it was something that I really wanted to do. I was gung-ho about doing it. So, and I was getting paid, like, not a fair wage, but I was still getting paid at least. I could, afford to eat, afford my rent, and go out once every 3 weeks, and that was about it. But during football season, it's not like we were going out anyway, because we were just grinding 7 days a week trying to put out all of this content. But I had the switch, Davis, between being someone who I think the people considered to be pretty sharp at the time, whether it was writing about baseball, whether it was writing about football, to almost what Pete talked about, that I wanted to transition my show into something that was entertaining, something that people could listen to, and especially, like, I see it in the numbers. Like, when me, Cust, and Jeff get together and talk about spread picks, half the people don't even like to gamble on football, but they like that show because they feel like they're our friends. Like, that's a part of it. And I think that is uniquely the hardest thing to build, especially in this space.
I mean, that's like thinking about myself, like, what kind of content do I enjoy the most? I mean, the only fantasy shows that I have in my feed are your show, Pat, and Peter's show, Ship Chasing. Those are the only 2 fantasy shows that I subscribe to because I like you guys. You guys are my friends. I enjoy hearing you guys talk about whatever, Pat. I enjoy listening to you guys talk about golf. I enjoy listening to Feinberg like lose his mind about the Chargers. I love listening to Pete get like more and more drunk over the course of a 3-hour stream, while Pat Crane and Ben Gretsch like try to keep the show somewhat on the rails. And I mean, even in non-fantasy content, the same thing. Like if I am not getting a good vibe from the host, like if I just don't find whatever to be amenable, then I'm not gonna bond with it. I'm not gonna engage with it. And then the same is true in some ways with writing. Now with writing, maybe I will read something on RotoViz or whatever, where like I have no idea the guy who's writing it. Like I've never met him. I don't know who he is, but I have like a good feeling towards that website. And I actually think, Pat, you made another good point there. It's very reputationally based. So it doesn't even necessarily matter what happens or what the first content someone interacts with you is, whether it be written, whether it be audio, whether it be audio visual. But like if they are coming to it from like a good reputational source, like if someone they really like tells you like, oh, this is a good podcast, this is a good article, that will go a long way. Like when Sean Siegel recommends some article on RotoViz on his podcast, I'm probably going to go read it, even if I don't know the guy who wrote it, simply because it's coming from a source that I like trust and think would be good.
How have you found, Pete, like, because it's not like you're new to the fantasy space. Obviously, the reason that you made this decision that you could do this full time is that you've been around forever creating content at the same time, but you were doing it as a part of your real life too. Like you had your real life, your real job, and then you were doing this on the side. Now you've kind of transitioned over into doing this full time. Has it become less fun for you yet? Because that inevitably always ends up happening.
It hasn't become less fun. I am working way more, even though I was kind of doing this on the side and essentially kind of doing two jobs even before I left my job. I think now that the onus is on me for everything and in my livelihood, and I definitely feel myself pounding the pavement more. And I think I've mentioned this to Davis too, but it used to be like I punch out at 5, I'm chilling in the evening, then maybe I have a show or whatever. But now it's like, oh, I need to set myself up for tomorrow. So I've noticed way more working in the 5 to 8 p.m. range when I normally would punch out, because I got to get all my ducks in a row, my administrative stuff, make sure my thumbnails are ready, the guests are booked, all that stuff that kind of starts to sneak up on you. So I will say, though, I do really, really enjoy it. Like I get excited every day to come down to my desk, start writing the newsletter, get ready for the shows that day. I do feel extremely grateful and excited to have that feeling, to know that I'm building something that where I can capture the upside. And I think that's a feeling that I hope doesn't go away.
It will start to grind on you on the administrative side, because there's always so much money to go around. So when you see a lot of people being creators, they are self-creators at this point. Like I have Paul, who is my producer, and I was only ever able to hire Paul because of when DraftKings brought me on to go with them. Like I was like, I need a producer to be able to do all this content that you want. Like it is unsustainable for me to continue to work 80 hours a week and do every single job by myself. And just taking away the burden of that, knowing that I had someone very capable, someone that I knew, someone that I trusted, that I could rely on for this time of thing. And like one of the big things, like even with Paul, who's switching the show right now, was when I went to go hire him, I knew he had the same work ethic as me. And that's just really hard to find, that I need someone who's going to go at this as hard as I want to go and do as much content as possible. Like if someone's like, yeah, I only want to work like 15 hours a week, like that would end up being really tough. Then the onus would come back on me. But now, like where I've evolved into running the Mayo Media Network, so we have 9 shows. I'm out trying to get like ad sales done. And I have to sit through these meetings where I'm just like, can you send me an email, please? But like that's taking time out of my day. The thing that I love to do and why I continue to do the grind is I love sitting in front of this camera, talking into this microphone and talking about fantasy football, shooting the shit with Jeff and Cuss on Cuss Corner, talking about golf, talking about anything really, Davis. And I think you've captured that really well with the TakeCast, where you've just essentially fused everything that you're excited about in life all into one place and try to tie it all together. But the actual recording of the show is the alluring part to everything. Like that part doesn't go away. That's the fun part.
Yeah, I mean that's why if you come down to it, like all of the stuff that I do, I do the season long projections for Sports Grid, I do the weekly projections for Daily Roto, I do administrative stuff behind the scenes, corporate stuff, and like really at the end of the day, and we do the TV show and everything, and really at the end of the day, and the TV show is fun. But like my motivation for doing all of those things is so that I can be paid to do the podcast, so that I can be paid to do the Takecast, that I can be paid to do the Sports Grid Fantasy Football Show, because those would be things that I would want to be doing, if I was working a 9 to 5 at a desk, right? So if I was, just an insurance salesman or whatever, or working in marketing for some company, I would still want to be doing some kind of content creation, like how Pete was doing, right? Pete was working his 9 to 5 and still doing all of his shows and everything. Like I would still want to be doing that. And so like if I ever feel like, God, does the 17% market share for Deontay Harris versus Marquez Callaway this week really matter? Like it's very easy for me to zoom out and be like, really it's all just steps in a row. And like one thing, and Pat, I bet you are familiar with this, and Pete too, is like when you work for a fantasy sports company, particularly one that's on like the smaller side, like not ESPN, not CBS, not Yahoo, you're going to be asked to wear a lot of different hats, know a lot of different people, have a good working relationship with people who work for other companies. And like that's something I'm good at. Is I would say probably one of the things I actually bring to the table relative to someone who might be really good with spreadsheets and data visualization and stuff is my ability to network. And that's actually like a huge thing in fantasy sports.
It's funny because I always felt like, networking, I never did it. So it didn't really, when I came out of college, I went to broadcasting school and I saw a lot of people who had industry connections who ended up just getting good jobs out of it. They were good.
Yeah.
I do, like they weren't undeserving of those jobs, but they got those jobs because they knew the people who did the hiring. And I found myself like, a decade later, I started my own company, and who did I hire? All of the people that I knew could do the job, because when you're working for a smaller place, like I said, I launched my own company. So it was me doing all the hiring at the onset. Like obviously I hired Paul. I hired my old intern at Fantasy because I taught him my content schedule, how I like to work. I was like, you're a very logical fit for me for here. I don't need to spend 2 months training you on this. I'm going to bring you into the fold. But I feel like that is one part of it. Like doing the great content is one thing. Like Pete, you had great content, but what made you make the decision to go into fantasy full time? Is it because you love doing it? Is it because you saw the potential to make a lot of money doing this, or at least make the same amount of money doing something else that you liked? And do you think that the networking part really did help you too? Like having so many contacts around that would be either willing to hook you up with certain people or give you more exposure, or like what made you make that decision?
Yeah, it was, I never looked at it super pragmatically like that, as far as, what networking, what stuff can get you there. I felt like I had this luxury safety net of, I can just do this stuff on the side at my own time. I never set any arbitrary benchmarks or goals. And I always knew like maybe I could work a little harder. Maybe I could try to monetize things earlier and open doors quicker. But I also didn't want to just kill myself essentially doing 2 jobs. And I was just kind of always at peace with, I thought I would get there, but I was okay with it happening at a slower trajectory. Then COVID hit, and I just had all this runway to do shows nonstop. And almost everything that I'm doing now, all those opportunities really came about from just doing a year straight of, 6-7 shows a week during that. So it was a really unique circumstance that I think kind of, short or, expedited kind of the trajectory I was on. So it's always interesting too, because I remember, talking with like stand-up comedians, and they used to always say, if you have the safety net of your job, you'll never make it. And I always kind of push back against that, because I just never wanted things to feel like a grind. I always wanted to find that equilibrium of where I could have my day job, do this as a hobby. And just in the past few months, the scales kind of finally shifted. And I felt like I can't do all the stuff on the side well that I want to do with the time I have now, with having to make myself available for midday meetings. And I just kind of said, all right, now enough is enough. If I'm going to go for this, I need to do it. And luckily with some sponsorships with my YouTube channel, with Underdog, with Run the Sims, Pat, who we're going to be doing lots of stuff with this year, it all just kind of came together in a really organic way.
I agree, but I think that your familiarity with like who don't you know around the business basically at the same time that like whether that's always the way that I felt about networking. You know, I wasn't actively trying to do it, but like Davis and I have become friends over there. You and I have become friends over there. Like that in a way itself is networking though, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I guess networking just has this more derogatory, like ladder climbing connotation to it that I guess I wouldn't. I think to me though, it is more.
Well, yeah, you think of it as like such a douchey thing. Like that's what you hear like the bad guy in like a Hallmark movie. Like the guy that shouldn't be with the girl in the Hallmark movie is like always busy networking and can't come home to small town Christmas or whatever.
Yeah. And I thought the way I truly think of it is like when I started out too, it was like I gravitated toward the content I like. I made the Swolecast parody video because I loved Kitchen and Tuttle and Davis and Silva. Like those are, I started doing stuff with Denny Carter because I was consuming and listening to the Living the Stream podcast. So I was just gravitated to the people I liked and then just started reaching out, doing collabs just as almost like fan offerings to these guys. Hey, I really appreciate your stuff. I would love to be in the mix, and everything kind of just snowballs from there.
And I've found that to be the case when I've done some hiring at Mayo Media Network now. So like I've tried like, I didn't have any soccer people. So like there was a guy who was just, a viewer of the show. Like, hey, I'm actually pretty good at DraftKings soccer. Do you mind if I give this a try? And he sent me a video. We worked on it for a bit. And like, he's doing MLS picks on the channel now. Like there are ways to break it.
Is that Puccio?
No, Puccio I had on for Euro. It's Ethan Kershaw that does the MLS picks for me.
Yeah, I know Puccio. He's a good deal. That guy does good work.
Yeah,
there's some networking.
Yeah, he was excellent. And the only reason that I knew about Puccio is because Nando used to be my boss at Fantasy. He's at The Athletic now. And I reached out to him. I was like, hey, do you have anyone good that you know about soccer? Like, I'm not super familiar with the soccer space. I know that you are more familiar with this, just managing a bunch of people and seeing people come in, people come out, doing work with you at The Athletic, either on a full-time or freelance basis. Like, can you recommend anyone for me? And like, that's how people are getting jobs. Like, unless you really make a scene, it's going to be really hard to upgrade yourself in that circumstance without doing any networking. Like the only guy that I can think of, Pete, is your buddy, is the counselor who's really done this all by himself.
Yeah. I mean, when you have that lion mentality, you don't need to network with sheep, Pat. I think it just kind of works out in its way when you're an alpha like that. Yeah,
it's tough to do, but like, it's funny to even see like, whether it's the character that Joe is playing. Like I've talked to the counselor a few times. I had him on the show. I went on his show like to talk to him. He's actually like a pretty decent dude, but like the character that he's playing right now, and he really monopolized Instagram early versus a lot of other people who were in the fantasy space. Like everyone's on Twitter, everyone's doing podcasts. So he's just doing Instagram and absolutely crushing it versus everyone else in the space. That was a unique lane that he picked, grew the following up, and now he just gets severe interaction by saying the absolute craziest things possible, Davis. But he's essentially doing like the low rent Tommy G move now.
Well, yeah, more power to him. I think that actually you just hit at a good thing there, which is that the world probably doesn't need another fantasy football podcast. The world probably doesn't need another FF Dynasty Bro Good Times Twitter handle. But like, there is room on YouTube still. I think there is still room on TikTok. I think there is still room on Instagram and things like that, because those are spaces that are not nearly as exploited in the space as Twitter and podcasts. Like if I was trying to get into fantasy today, I mean, obviously you need a Twitter, but I would definitely go the YouTube route via a podcast. Like no doubt about it.
Yeah, because we paired up at Run the Sims with Jake over at the fantasy football headliners, and just to see their following on YouTube, Pete, like I was blown away when I started looking into it. It's like I can't believe how many subs that they have. And then I went over and then looked at Twitter. Like they have a lot of followers, but it's not like the very top end where they kind of dominate YouTube just very covertly. Them and the footballers.
Yeah, there's all those corners of YouTube where it does still seem relatively untapped when you look at the saturation of, Twitter analysts and podcasts. It's disproportionate to the amount of content on YouTube. And I don't know, why do you think that is, Pat? Because is it just, I mean, it is a grind on YouTube and it is hard to build. Why do you think, people don't gravitate there as much as the other mediums?
I'm not sure, because it seems like it would be a lot easier on YouTube because where it's integrated with Google that you actually get SEO value out of it. Like I was having this conversation with Holka the other day, Davis, and he's just like, yeah, my YouTube numbers are really good. It's hard to build the audio podcast. I was like, the only reason that I have a lot of audio podcast listeners is because I've had this podcast feed for 11 years, because podcasts aren't searchable and discoverable in the same way that a YouTube video is. So that's why I would really I would tell people to go to YouTube over starting a podcast at this point. Now, I just do both. It's the same show on both platforms, but there are certain shows that hit for me big on YouTube versus the podcast and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, there's no good search functionality for podcasts. In most podcasts I find, if it's a new podcast, I find via Twitter or like honestly through accident. But I would say 80% of my new podcasts I find through Twitter, and that would be a miserable space to come in and try and start a podcast with, 800 followers or whatever.
That's why I always try to recommend that people share the podcast that they like, to tell a friend, because word of mouth is the only way for that stuff to get around.
Yeah, the only other thing I can think of is sometimes in those apps they now have, I use Pocket Cast because I am apparently regrettably an Android bro, but in Pocket Cast they have a what's trending section. And I feel like that might be the only other way to get organic growth. What's on the top of the iTunes charts, what's trending in these podcast apps, but otherwise there's just no kind of organic growth there.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that the established podcasts, especially in the fantasy space, continue to grow while the other ones can't gain traction. I always try to equate myself a little bit as sort of like the dummy version of JJ. So JJ has his podcast. He's had it almost the same amount of time that I've had mine. We used to be big pals. Then we went to different companies. We just can't do content together anymore because both of our contracts state that we can't do that. So that's always tough because we used to do a ton of shows together all the time. But so we have these two podcasts and we're both consistently inside the top 10 of the fantasy football charts, way behind the footballers. I mean, in terms of the charts, we're not way behind, but in terms of actual downloads, it's basically the footballers, ESPN, CBS, fantasy pros. They really dominate that space. And it's me, JJ, the ETR guys. The ETR guys and their podcast is really sort of the only new-ish podcast that is broken up inside that tier, Davis. And that's because they had Silva and Levitan and Leone and Dink and all these guys to go promote it at the same time. People knew, and then they were actively tweeting about it, and they had this huge sub base. But other than that, how is anyone... I've tried to launch a bunch of podcasts recently, and if I wasn't the driving force behind them and using my podcast to push people to other podcasts, I don't know if they'd have more than 10 listeners.
No, I don't know. I don't know if they would either. Go ahead, Pete.
I was just going to say, so here's a question, because one thing I've been debating just making a podcast feed for some of my, video streams in the same way, Pat and Davis, you guys will repost stuff. And I've not because I want to grow a podcast feed, although maybe I should have that goal, but more just because I get requests from people who are like, I don't, it's harder for me to watch YouTube on the go or whatever. Will you just upload the audio? My thought is when I'm doing these drafts, it's way more visual anyways. Should I just get off my ass and make a podcast feed and start throwing the audio up there?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. The sneaky thing about the Pat Mayo experience is that the audio is around 5 times the viewership of the video. And people and people never can figure that out. And when it comes to actual ad sales and monetization, it took a really long time for people to be able to monetize audio podcasts properly. But the rate that you'll get for a mid-roll ad in an audio podcast versus something like the mid-roll ad sponsorship from a YouTube video is substantially more. Unless you have ingrained embedded video sponsorship like Pete you do with runthesims.com. Runthesims.com will pay you to promote that because that we want to be a part of your content. We think that's a great space to get our message out from that. And then that's good floor money for you to make every week. And then you can monetize the YouTube version of it too. But if you can have a large enough audio podcast, there's just a lot more money that comes along with it if you're willing to do the ad sales for it. It's just more valuable because people who come onto YouTube, and you can see this in like the analytics when you go look at videos, like there's just a lot of people who click on the video and immediately click out. There are very few people that download a podcast and turn it on that don't listen for like at least 10 minutes.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense that people would be less flighty with podcasts than videos.
So I think that's why
and
the ad rate is
there.
more.
There are people who will listen to both. I listen to this podcast called The 9 Club, and they do 3 episodes a week. They always upload it to YouTube. I think they have like 200,000 subscribers on YouTube, and they also upload it as a podcast. And the episode that they do on Wednesdays has like a heavy video element to it, where like I will watch that show on YouTube. Like I will like visually engage with it. But the shows on Mondays and Fridays, like, yeah, there is a visual element. Maybe they'll talk about like a picture or something on there and like, oh, you know, I wish I had this pulled up. But I mostly listen to those episodes via podcast. So yeah, maybe like a draft, someone like they'd want to be seeing the main event board or whatever. But there's a lot of content you do that people would be fine engaging with via just an audio medium.
Well, I can tell you too that like the most popular show all year that I do audio wise is me, Feinberg, and Cust Wednesday Pick Show. It's not even close. It does almost double what any of the other audio podcasts do for me. But it is probably my least popular YouTube video of the week. That is something that people have said that I would just rather listen to this rather than watch it. Like there's no discernible reason for you to watch it unless you really like looking at me or really like looking at Jeff. Like that is the perfect audio podcast for the format of that show. However, something like the ranking show that I do with Jake Seeley, people really like that in the video version because they can see the rankings on the screen while we're talking about it. That does well audio-wise, but it doesn't do nearly as well as the video version does. So I can see what you're saying with that. Is I think some people tune into audio for certain things, some people tune into video for other things.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And I'm the same way personally. I barely watch any YouTube, but I'll listen to all kinds of stuff on the go, on podcasts, doing chores, in the car, at the gym. So it doesn't make sense why I haven't made a podcast feed, considering that's how I would probably prefer to consume as well. So I appreciate the encouragement. I will put that on my to-do list for today.
Well, the biggest thing too is that once you're done with a video file, like making the podcast, if it's just essentially a repurpose of it, like I have to go add in an ad or something like that, or if I mix 2 videos together as a part of a longer podcast, like that's one thing that I found out over time, that doing too many shows was bad for my podcast feed, where especially in football season, like I'll record my golf show on Monday evening and release it, but then I'll do the rankings on Tuesday morning and release it. And then I'll release the spread pick show around like midnight on Tuesday. Like that's just too much going on my thread. So I'll release the video for the golf, but I'll hold it till the next day and make the rankings and the golf all one podcast. So it's not monopolizing from any of the other ones. And then, oh, my voice is going now. And it keeps your numbers down because only so many people, like if let's say people have auto downloads turned on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Davis, that if you release one at like midnight and then another one at like 10 o'clock in the morning, you're just not going to get the same amount of auto download. So it actually hurts your iTunes rating at the same time. Now, I know this is just really weird stuff. Like to the consumer, none of that means anything. Like, oh, I don't give a shit about listening to golf. I only want to listen to football, or vice versa. So it kind of sucks that I put it in the same show. But for me to stay in the Apple charts, which is important to my business, like I had to make that switch. And that's sort of, when I talk about like the shitty part of the job, like figuring out that stuff and learning about that stuff is the shitty part of the job. But I think it's important if you want to do this full time.
And that's the thing I was wrestling with. And you mentioned that earlier about how the administrative stuff starts to weigh on you, is I feel like there's this fine line between what are things you're actually curious about learning about. Like I've launched my Shopify store in the past month, and I've actually had a good amount of fun learning the ins and outs. How does drop shipping work? How does fulfillment work? All this kinds of stuff. But then there's other things that I'm just not remotely intellectually curious about, like on the accounting side and, having to pay, contractors and all of this stuff. Like I would love if I could offload that to someone else. But when you're doing this all on your own, it's hard to actually pick and choose what you do. You basically just have to do it all.
Because there's only so much money to go around, and you need a certain baseline for yourself in order to live. And you can't, like, you then have to tackle all these jobs that maybe you're not familiar with, or maybe you can't even do a great job with, but you have to piece it together, Davis. Because if you start paying someone else to do that job, now you're doing your work for free again.
Right, exactly. I mean, and that is why one of the things you would learn in pretty much any industry these days is like just learning some self-sufficiency, being able to do things yourself. Like Pete, you do your own like YouTube thumbnails, right? And that saves you money, that saves you time, and like it's something pretty small. Anything that is like a relatively minor to learn task that most people would have to outsource that you can learn to do yourself is massive. And not even necessarily in the positions for the three of us, but if you are looking to get into the fantasy space, the ability to do multiple things with like some competency is pretty big. Like if you can handle your spreadsheets, if you are, I mean, good on audio, video, I mean, that would be the biggest thing I would tell anyone, right? It's like if you're not good on audio, if you're not good on TV, the space is definitely moving away from you. But having the proficiency in the spreadsheets, having the proficiency with the data is also very important. Because like, for example, in my job, like I do both. Like I do TV 5 days a week, I do the podcast, and then I also manage all of these projections. And if I wasn't able to do all of those things, I would be certainly much less valuable from like a corporate perspective.
Well, Pete, how did you learn all the technical stuff in terms of video editing and video production? Because that is the single hardest thing to do because it's such a foreign world to everyone. Like I went to school to learn this stuff and I did. So did Paul. That's where we met. So I knew that he knew what I knew about video production and everything like that. But even when we went into the streaming world, like there was a lot that we just continued to had to learn, and learning that from scratch has got to be tough.
Yeah. And I was luckily able to use just my energy and enthusiasm for some of the video projects I was working on. And just, I remember my best example was I had done this, I do this character, Pete Manzanelli, and I'd done this event called the Broathlon with guys you guys know, Jonathan Bales and Adam Levitan. And I had all this incredible footage of us getting drunk, doing these ridiculous things. And I was transitioning from iMovie to Final Cut Pro. I was like, I'm done with iMovie. Doesn't have all the bells and whistles I need to do these things, but I have no clue how to use Final Cut Pro. And I sat down with all this raw footage and I spent just 2 days straight. I probably did legit 20 hours just Googling how to do this. I want to do this effect. How do I do this? And just doing that one video through like 20 hours, I got a video that was decent. And I basically taught myself Final Cut Pro. And so for me, those things, and when I say taught myself, I mean like baseline competency with it. And so I just used my curiosity to figure out how to do new things. But I have felt for video editing, I'm competent, but I don't have the curiosity or the desire now to learn new stuff. And I actually am paying people now more to help edit videos for me because I just don't like spending my time doing that.
Yeah, I see. Like Holka is another one who's very self-taught. And he does really good short form, like taking his long form stuff and then transitioning it with graphics, with editing into social media videos to post on different platforms. And that's all self-taught on his end. Like when we have a problem around here, Davis, like Paul jumps on YouTube. If there's no answer there, he's on message boards trying to find similar problems that people have gotten into. And it feels like that's a really hard step to make because it does feel like it requires a little bit of baseline knowledge or curiosity to begin with. But if it's something you feel like you're forced to have to do, you might just not ever do it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, learning in general, we're going to engage with our neuroplasticity better if it's something that you want to do. If you're going into a task and you are really stressed out. Now, I mean, if you get your adrenaline firing enough, you can learn something faster, but like learning Final Cut Pro, you're probably not going to be engaging with your adrenaline. So it's going to be very hard to learn that. So in general, to get your brain to actually learn things, you have to be generating curiosity from a natural way. Like it's very hard to learn something if at like a very base mental level, you are not interested in it. And so like learning how to do YouTube thumbnails, I assume at the beginning for Pete, that was something that was fun. And then maybe at a certain point, like now when you're doing, your week 4 splash play, like DFS podcast graphic, you're like, dude, I just wish that I could snap my fingers and have this being done. But originally, when you were originally learning it, it was fun.
Yeah, it is. It is tough. The one thing I will say is I've done so many of them that I have my process completely streamlined. I have a folder archive of photos of Pat Mayo with a transparent PNG background. I have photos of Davis Mattek. When we hop on a show, I can easily pull those up. I kind of know my workflow and I can bang it out in a way that doesn't feel too cumbersome. And I think that's also the key. Like, what are the things, the tasks that you can almost automate or batch process in a way where it doesn't, take extra thought? Where I really get hung up is when I have a new project I have to tackle and I know I don't have to do it. And I know I need to block out 2 hours to do an hour of reading and tutorials, then some trial and error. That's where I really get overwhelmed. The stuff I know I can bang out in 5 minutes, I'm like, all right, let's just do this.
So I think that's super. I'm exactly the same way. There's so much, like, I've had this game show, Davis, the raw footage for it for over a year now. I have all of the graphic templates built, but I still have to go back in, fill out all the templates, which is probably going to take like 3 hours to do because I don't know how to use the templates yet. So there's a trial and error part and I know that there are certain parts of the show that need to be cut and certain parts that need to be sliced together. And I lost the sheet where I had all my notes on it of where to make all those cuts. So I actually have to watch through like an hour of raw footage, go through, make all the cuts, make all the time codes, correlate the boards with everything, bring them up at the right time. Like, it's going to be like a legit 2-day event for this like half-hour show that I don't think that anyone's going to watch anyway. So I just have not got off my ass in order to do it. But what Pete hit on about having these folders with different pictures into it. So A, you save a ton of time because you're not re-downloading the same stuff all the time. And I think that understanding what's important to the process and what can be templated. Like, I have so many templates, it is ridiculous for almost every single style of show I do. Like, it really doesn't mean anything. The YouTube write-up of something. It has to reflect what the video is actually about. But I just, like, for the golf show every single week, like, I change the name of it. Pat Mayo and Jeff Feinberg make their picks for Control F tournament, search and replace tournament, and it changes all my SEO tags for the video element of it. I kind of structure the show the same way every single week. I just go change those time codes. I change the name of the course, but that's done. That takes like 28 seconds. But if I was to do that from scratch every single week and didn't have a plan of it going in, that would take me like 20 minutes, 25 minutes to like brainstorm, like, oh yeah, what do I use here? What do I want to title this? Same thing as Pete with the thumbnails. Like, you've given yourself the options, but now it's an efficiency thing. Like, you're not spending the most creative time in the world on stuff like that. So I guess my point is, Davis, how organized are you today versus what you were 6 years ago?
So I am much more organized now. I pretty much have a schedule of everything that I know that I need to do. I could always be more organized. Sometimes I am scrambling for a podcast guest, or, I should have posted the show on Wednesday morning. I didn't post it until Wednesday afternoon, things like that. But in terms of like, especially my in-season NFL DFS, like workflow, like I have everything mapped out on Google Calendar. Like I know, like, okay, Tuesday, I am going from top to bottom, every team in the NFL. I'm going to rework all the projections and get them in a good place. I know that I have, okay, the podcast has to be done and posted by this time. And I know, like, okay, this article has to be posted on this day. And I have that all set up. We actually just did real behind the curtain stuff. We just did a huge redo to our sheet process for how we do projections on dailyroto.com, which is going to hopefully free up a bunch of hours of my week in terms of like going and like looking up market share stuff. Because before I would kind of have to use a separate tool on our website to go and find things. But now all of the data is actually displayed in the sheet that we do projections on. So that's super nice. But I know Pete is actually even more hyper organized. Like he has his whole thing mapped out.
I mean, I've talked to Davis about it, but I basically had to buckle down because I just got too overwhelmed with checking in on group chats, checking in on Discord. This year, my Discord has gotten very big, partly because of the NFT boom. There's a whole channel that I'm barely involved in. That's the most active channel in my Discord. But all of these things start to just suck time out of your day. And I'm not able to get everything done unless I'm time blocking. And I've noticed that. And what I mean by time blocking is basically, instead of having a to-do list, I just put those to-do lists on my calendar directly. And I found that it's massive, just the difference being like, you're going to do this thing today versus you're going to do this thing at this time. It feels non-negotiable when it's on the calendar. And my days are legitimately night and day different when I schedule out my day. If I don't schedule it out, I'm wasting all kinds of time. Oh, why don't I just hop in a draft right now instead of doing this work? Whereas if I have my things to do at certain times, I bang it out. It's non-negotiable. And so that's been huge for me. And I will say, I still don't time block every day. I get lazy and then those days aren't good.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens to me. It's funny that you say you scramble for podcast guests, Davis. That's why I use the same people every single week. Like, we're going to get into a part of the season like this happens because I like to use my DraftKings show, whether it be for golf or for NFL, as a rotating spot every single week where I can get, I mean, it's not... That is an information and pick show. So I like to have really good, sharp people on for that one. And I like to spread the love around. I don't want, if I get Levitan to do it one week, I'm like, hey, Adam, can you do this for 18 straight weeks? Like, that's a big ask from someone. Yeah. Getting him to do it twice a year, 2 Thursdays a year, he can swing that. Or you can swing that. Pete can swing that. And then you can have different voices, and having different voices on your show will only help the show grow at the same time, because like someone might say like, oh, hey, I'm a Davis fan. I'm going to tune into this show. Oh, this show's not bad. Maybe I'll watch it next week when someone else is on as well. So booking your guests strategically that way. But I find myself a lot of the time with those shows being like an hour before, like, hey, Raza, can you jump on, man?
Yeah, no. And so like, I mean, to really take people behind the curtain, like it's actually funny. The fantasy football show, I don't ever have anyone, it's never a problem. Like Corain can do it. Gretch can do it. Reeves will do it, so like one of my buddies will have a morning or an afternoon available. Like that's never a problem. What is I have trouble getting guests for is for the Take Cast, where like I want to do different things with that show. Like I wanted to be, one show I wanted to be about crypto legislation. One show I wanted to be like with a pro golfer, or like, so, and I am always sending out emails to like really famous people, just to see, cause you never know, like, I've gotten some authors on, Ethan Sherwood Strauss, like all kinds of people, but like that takes real planning, because you can't reach out to someone you don't know and be like, hey dude, are you happen to be free this afternoon? And like, sometimes I'll think that's lined up. Like I'll reach out to someone, their publicist will get back to me and they'll be like, yeah, like we can maybe do that. And then I won't have like a backup and plan. And then if that ever falls through, that's basically when I'm like, hey, Pat, do you want to do the show? Hey, Pete, do you want to do the show? So there's that peek behind the curtain.
Yeah. If you ever see Peter I on the Take Cast, it's because a guest fell through last second.
That's pretty much 100% accurate.
And I wrestle with this a ton, because one huge positive of having the same type of guests is the rapport is really good. Like,
yep.
Also it's easy for the host. Davis knows when we come on to the Take Cast that it's going to just be a free flowing conversation. There doesn't have to be a lot of prep, but there's also kind of a depth to our relationships where there's lots of stuff to mine. There's callbacks to jokes. There's lots of kind of wells we can go back to. And I think listeners really enjoy that. I wrestle with that for booking my randomizer guests a lot, because I want to get new people in there. But what happens sometimes is the prompts and the suggestions and the shows are more electric when it's guests that my audience is extremely familiar with, or when I have rapports with people. Like when I do a show with Jack Settleman every week, but the prompts for the randomizer were so good because people felt comfortable dicking around with us. I have Bill Barnwell on, who I love and was great, but everyone's giving him kind of trivia questions. They're not making him pour a beer into a Frisbee and drink it, just because there's not that level of familiarity there. So I wrestle with that all the time, of just playing the hits versus pushing outside your comfort zone.
I think that if you can, I mean, that's essentially what Cuss Corner was when we first started that, Davis, was just like, hey, this is kind of fun to do. We all enjoy doing it. And now people have really come to like that show.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I would assume that other than the pick show, like what you get the most like social media commentary on and the most interaction with is that. And kind of actually one of two things will happen. I'll bring on someone to the Take Cast who like, I'm like, this dude is the best. I love your book. I love your, whatever it is. And sometimes it'll be really good. Like I remember when Andy from Club Top Shot came on and we got like really deep into the crypto space. That one was really big. Or I had Ryan Doubt on the show, who is really high stakes, like poker player and DFS player.
I like that
and
one.
that show.
I like that one.
That one got like loads of listens, right? But then sometimes I'll have a guy on. I actually remember I had Jonathan Wilson on, who is an author. He is like, to me, he is like the best writer about soccer that there is in the world. But because my audience doesn't really care that much about that, like it was fine. Like it wasn't like no one listened to it, but I thought that one would be like, oh, this is going to get loads of listens. This is going to get lots of social media traction. And it didn't. And I can't ever really predict those things. Like I never know which episode is going to be like a banger and which one is just going to be, another episode.
That's what happens to me with my challenge shows. Like sometimes, like when Paul and I used to do it, and we would do it every week at the same time every week. Like Pete, how much have you found that out, that the consistency of when your shows start, when your shows come out, is like half the battle?
Yeah.
Yes.
It really is. I do think people knowing what's going to be coming, what type of show, what stuff they're getting into, I think that really helps. I've been a little bad with it because, similar to you guys, sometimes I get the guest book well in advance and I can promote that. Sometimes I don't. And so it's harder to promote, but I was messing around with creating a little bit of a weekly schedule and posting that in the YouTube community tab, posting it in my Discord. Hey, here's the shows, here's the guests, build excitement. People can kind of mark their own calendar. I do a lot of shows at night. And so I always assume people need to plan around that. I actually did some polls in my Discord because I was contemplating moving some of my shows to the afternoon, like the randomizer one. I was like, could I do this on the late afternoon, figuring people would rather watch when they're at work? And almost all the feedback I got were from people who, either had obligations or they had kids, and they're like, no, we like doing our thing in the evening, having dinner, putting the kids down, and then watching the show. And I was like, wow, it was me selfishly who wanted to do it in the afternoon so I could free up my evening, but that wasn't actually how a lot of my viewers were consuming the content.
Yeah, Javis, do you struggle with trying to provide content with how people like to consume it versus what you would actually want to do? Because I struggle with that a lot. Like I always do this late Friday night record. I fucking hate it. But when else it would not make sense to record like an injury show at any other time.
Yeah, you can't do an injury show on Thursday in the afternoon. So I actually, for the fantasy football show, I take like lots of feedback. Like actually some of the episodes that Corain and I have done the last couple of weeks were literally like, a couple of people were like, will you guys just do a show about wide receivers and like which ones you want to take at ADP and which ones you don't? And that was a whole episode. The zero RB stuff, people want the picks. They like, okay, if I'm doing zero RB, which guys do we take? So we did that. So like with that show, I'm cool taking more listener feedback. With the Takecast, I pretty much just do what I'm interested in. And if people like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't. And it's good. It's nice for me to have those multiple outlets. I feel like, Pat, like there's got to be times where you feel frustrated with your feed because you might really want to have on a guest to talk about something. And then they come on and you just like, people are like, what is this? Like, I'm not engaging with this at all.
Yeah, it sucks. And I get super amped about it. And I just go look at the numbers like, oh, this is the lowest rated show I've ever done in my entire life. And I was like, I thought it was a good show. I thought it was interesting, but selling people on stuff you're interested in when it's not something that you normally do is really hard because this community is so micro. And I think that people really forget about that these broad ranging topics aren't necessarily what your audience wants to listen to. Like, I have a feeling that this is not going to be our highest rated show, Pete.
You know what? It might not be, but I will say, and I assume it's one of the reasons we're doing it. And Davis and I have done some of these, talking shop shows too. I did one with Holka and Jordan, who is the guy who actually helped me set up my my Shopify store, a guy behind the scenes who is a wizard with that stuff. And people do really enjoy these peels behind the curtain. It doesn't necessarily have the mass appeal as the top 5 running back sleepers to take this year, but I think some of our most engaged fans really, really value this kind of content.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it appeals to the industry as well, which is nice because people in the industry are usually good people who will share the show around like, hey, I found this interesting. You might too. Or like, this show sucks. Never listen to this. With me, you can never really tell with how this is going to come out. But I mean, partial reason that I'm doing this, I just recorded with Holka before this. Like I'm now into like hour 4 of recording shows straight. It's because it's 2 weeks before football. I'm going away this weekend. I'm going to be gone for 3 days, and I need content that's going to last that I can air while I'm gone. Davis, I've gone 7 straight years and have not missed a show because I always have shows in the bank, shows in the can, that if I get sick or if I go on vacation, I've done at least 4 shows a week every week for the past 7 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty. I have pre-recorded episodes before to go on vacation, but there certainly has been times where a show has been up late, or I've uploaded a show on Thursday when they're supposed to be up on Wednesday, things like that. So as always, someone is willing to work a little bit harder than me, and I'm okay with that.
That's a plan, but that is a pure planning thing though. Like I really have to look in advance, being like, oh, I'm going away for 3 days with my wife, or I'm going to play golf for 3 days here. Like what feasibly can I talk about on this date that isn't going to be out of date when this show airs? Like that's going to happen. I mean, or you can just say, fuck it, I'm going on vacation. Fuck all of you. And maybe I should be doing that. I think that's probably healthy from time to time too. I don't know. What's your take on it, Pete?
Well, yeah, it's something I've actually encountered just recently because last weekend I was in Vegas for 4 nights. This past weekend, we were with some of our friends up in Maine. And I generally have always had the like all in or all off thing where it's like, I want to work really hard during the week and then I don't want to do anything on the weekends. I'm now writing the newsletter every day. And so I was getting up hungover in Vegas and writing the newsletter and kind of getting used to working and playing in the same way, which is still a hard transition for me. I guess I'll say I've gotten better about not necessarily worrying if I have a regular show that I didn't do. Like I do the Monday morning best ball stream every Monday. I didn't do that one when I was in Vegas. I was like, you know what? I can just survive. And maybe that's why I'm leaving growth and opportunities out there because I'm not, thinking ahead in that way. But I'm always just trying to find that balance and making sure I don't burn out. And so not stressing about missing stuff occasionally is kind of one way I avoid burnout.
I think that's a much healthier way to look at it, and something that I think after this football season, I'm really going to be trying to put in place. Like if I have to miss the Byron Nelson pick show for a week, Davis might have to miss it. And I think that people will be okay with that. I always worked under the impression though, just because I've seen it happen so often, is that the moment you're not doing something, you might be on the outs. And I think I have enough of an established community, listeners, viewers who are highly supportive that'd be like, hey, Pat, go take a vacation, man. It's okay. And I feel like I know that's the answer, but I've just seen it to people like they leave their desk for a week, they come back and they don't have a job anymore.
Yeah, and I feel like in your position, that's less likely to happen, right? You have the Mayo Media Network. It's a pod feed that people subscribe. You could even, Pat, do like classic episodes. Like you could like rebroadcast episodes and stuff. That's something.
That's a good idea. I'm gonna write that.
That's something that so like the first podcast that like everyone listened to when podcasts were first a thing, Stuff You Should Know. I bet you guys listened to it like 11 years ago or whatever. They do on Saturdays, they rebroadcast old episodes. They call it Stuff You Should Know Selects, right? And like that's a great idea. Like Pat, you have like a million episodes. You could go from 5 years ago. You could pull up, some evergreen episode. And when you're gone, you could repost it. And someone who just subscribed to the show a year before, they never would have found it. Bada bing, bada boom, new episode, new content for them.
Davis, you've allowed me to go take a vacation. Last thing, since you guys got to get out of here, because this is a hard scheduling thing to get the 3 of us on the go at this time. Pete, you're new to full time, but you've been around for a while. If someone's just starting or has been grinding in fantasy right now, what would you tell them in order for them to be able to make a career out of this? Like, what should they be doing? I would say spend less time on Twitter.
Yes, I mean that is honestly one of the best things you could do. Build somewhere else. Build on YouTube. Build on TikTok. Build a podcast. Get off Twitter. There's really diminishing returns there, in my opinion, other than just having fun in the replies of your friends. My main thing is, like you said at the top of the show, we joked around about IDP. Maybe it's not IDP. Find a niche that hasn't been oversaturated yet and that you love. You can't just I can't go do IDP content, even though I think there's a void. I don't enjoy it. I would burn out within about 4 hours of reading that content. So find something that is both underserved in the market and that you really, really enjoy engaging with. And then also just be realistic that it's going to take a while, but because you love the thing you are working on, it's not going to feel like a chore. And I think if you can triangulate that, something that's underserved that you really enjoy and have patience, I think you can succeed.
I would agree with that. Whatever you're talking about, you should have a lot of interest in, because that is going to translate, or whether you're writing about it. Like, there's a reason that I don't talk a ton about best ball. Like, I can talk about best ball. I do best ball drafts, but it's not something that I'm highly passionate about. Like you guys are. You guys love doing drafts, like wherever you are. Like, I don't. I'd rather just go to the driving range for an hour and like go hit balls or something like that. I feel like that would just be another extension of my job that I don't want to do. I'm also grinding golf like full time as a part of this as well. So now like it's a tougher transition when you guys are, Davis, when you need to do content in, late June, you can talk about best ball drafts that are going on, where I just lean full time on golf for that. So I don't quite get into it. So I would say that's one thing, like be passionate about what you're talking about 100%. I would also, Davis, really tell people to figure out when I say that don't be on Twitter, I just mean like, don't be like randomly like answer people's questions on Twitter, put out thoughtful tweets, share your stuff, but don't be like the bickering people on Twitter who just spend all their time bickering on Twitter and don't fucking do anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a real hurdle for me, is to not argue with egg accounts and actually to be a little bit more strategic about the stuff I put out there. And I mean, to your point, Pat, I'm literally doing an Underdog best ball fantasy football fast draft right now because I love it. I literally can't get enough of it. My advice to people would be, if you think fantasy football is your thing, you want to make it a career, I would say get as good as you possibly can get on camera. Learn to not be nervous on camera, learn to have like a good facial expression, like get rid of facial tics, like all of that stuff, because that is the direction that the people who have access to a budget to pay people are going. And if you're not good on camera, you're not good on podcasts, there is going to be less and less work for you. And the work that you will have is going to be very competitive work. There are going to be a lot of people who are willing to do it for less money. For free, basically. So I would really encourage you, if you really want to do that, to get very good at being on camera.
Well, I'm going to let you guys go because I've pressed about all of your time right now. At Davis Mattek on Twitter. Subscribe to the TakeCast podcast, sportsgrid.com, dailyroto.com. Subscribe to Pete Overzet's YouTube channel and follow him at Pete Overzet on Twitter. And then you'll have even more reasons to follow these guys and find out about their content. The last thing that there's 2 more hours of this we can talk about. The final tips that I'll leave you with. Find a way for an escape if you're doing this. I go to the gym. I know Davis goes on like the treadmill and does drafts. Like when I'm at the gym, I just pump in music. I don't think about this shit at all. And it really does clear my head that I can come back fresh. And I feel like going to the gym gives me energy to keep this going. Like if I'm going to be recording 8 hours a day, like I need to have strength and energy and feel good all day long to keep up that energy level. And number 2, besides knowing the technical stuff, is figure out a way to monetize this stuff. Figure out ad sales, figure out SEO, and figure out a way to monetize your content. Because if you own your content, the sky is the limit for the amount of money that you can make. If you're working for someone else, it's like any job. You own the stuff, it's going to be more difficult, it's going to be harder work, but you're going to get paid full on what your content is worth versus someone else owning your content and them getting paid and them then paying you after the fact. So keep those 2 things in mind. Sometimes it's inevitable, sometimes it's a gamble that you can take, but think about those 2 things in particular when it comes to creating your own content. Smash a like in the comment section. Please give me your underserved part of the fantasy community. Oh yeah, last one. Just talk about football gambling if you want to make money in the future, not fantasy football, because that's where all the money is right now. Shockingly enough.
Correct.
I will leave you with that. So learn how to gamble, even if you don't gamble a ton. Learn how to talk about it so you can do content for it. Smash like, sub, leave the comment. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience! Experience!